I wanted to talk briefly about my own personal history, about some of those moments when love was absolutely absent in my life. I'm a Kwakwaka'wakw person. The language I spoke in the beginning of my talk is a language spoken only by 50 or less people now in the entire universe, because some zealots a long time ago thought that was the pagan language and that we as children who were speaking this language ought to lose it so that we could lose our identity as Aboriginal people. I'm a hereditary chief among the chiefs. I belong to this culture that is as ancient as time itself. Do you know that we have Genesis stories of our own? That these Genesis stories that manifested, we call them first ancestor stories, happened in sacred sites all throughout our territories. We had 26 tribes then, there are 15 left. But every tribe had at least 4 sacred sites, 4 first ancestors. And these sites delineated the territories that we occupied. We had our own membership, our own extended families, our own laws, our own self-governance structures. We had our spiritual ways. And get this, because I experienced it as a child, we had reverence for all of creation. There was a sanctity about everything and everybody. Maybe there was a time when all our civilizations felt that way, but I think for the most part, we have begun to lose that sense of reverence and sanctity. And in our culture, we had one language, and we had a potlatch system that gave expression to our worldview, our values, and our purposes. It was the way that taught us how we lived out our lives, what our relationships with creation would be. How many of you think you have a relationship with creation? All of creation. I think we all should think that. So important. Because how we best sought out the meaning of it all. I had a little discovery not too long ago that makes me sort of secure in my own knowledge that I have some value, whether you agree with it or not, or anybody else agree with it. And it's this, I want to share it because it's really important to me. I believe that when I was given life, given breath, that there were essentially 2 purposes in the universe. The first purpose was this divine purpose that creates part of, or is part of the symphony of the universe itself. Divine, sacred, spiritual. And no matter what we do with our lives, we're always at the end of it going to be meeting that purpose because it's really beyond our control. It's a large universal purpose. And then we're gifted with the ability of choice, and we're allowed to create our individual purposes. Everybody here has an individual purpose. And I think sometimes you come to these beautiful, wonderful conferences because you want to touch base and ground yourself in the purpose for which you've chosen for your lives. But whatever those purposes are, I'm really just saying that everybody has value and purpose. I used to think about these matters when there were too many suicides in my community. And I wondered about how people felt about the condemnation that we gave and had for people who took their lives. Must have affected the family. Until one day that came to me, the very idea that even at those most tragic millisecond insanity moments, we still have value, we still have purpose. And I think that's a real solace to some of us to know that. In our culture, in our life way, we always sought to reconcile with everything, everybody. The things we could feel, the things we could touch, things we could smell. the things we couldn't see, the things we couldn't comprehend. We had ritual and song and dance that intended to give meaning to us about all of these things, whether we knew them intimately or not. And so, as a result of that, we did live in our communities and our societies a slightly gentler, softer, kinder life than the ones that I see around the globe with all the conflicts that we have. How can we begin, and maybe we could teach the young people whose lives you all influence so much, how can we begin to respect, embrace all of the parallel universes in our life? You know there are parallel universes, right? There's the sky world, the undersea kingdom, the spirit world, animal world. They're all parallel universes, which is to say that we are one creation with all the animals, with all the spirits, those things that fly, those things that crawl, all of it. They are our neighbors. And how do we make sure that we are kind and gentle and thoughtful of the future of all of creation? I was born into that ancient backdrop, free, independent, proud. I was robed with kindness and love. But soon on the horizon, there was a massive disruption coming to my life, to the life of Aboriginal people in this country. Monumental change was just around the corner. And then some of these ugly words began to manifest. Colonization, assimilation, genocide, acts of harm and loss and grief became the order of the day. Guess what the first victim of all of that was? The first victim was kindness and love. They were the first victims of the sweeping change that took place in our societies. I'm going to tell you a little bit of my experience in a residential school. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about my life experience as a 6-year-old before I got to that school. I was raised in a little village called Huayasam. It's about 200 miles north of here. And the little village was on a tiny midden, thousands of years old. Clamshells as far down as you could dig, you would find clamshells and beads over time. It was cradled by a forest behind it and waterfront in front of us. And we had a little one-room house on the waterfront side, and part of our house protruded over the water on stilts. And every day, my sister and I, my adopted foster sister and I, would watch through one little tiny window in the front of the house the tide come in, go out, rise, drop. All manner of sea life, the sea kingdom paraded before us, created before our very eyes. Geese and ducks and eagles and seagulls and crows all floated or swam before our very eyes. For a little kid around that time, that was our little paradise, a little Garden of Eden, a little piece of heaven. And pretty soon, that was all to be lost. Sometimes we saw whales and orcas, mink, octopus, crab, salmon, halibut. The land was rich and it supported us. At that time, I lived with my maternal grandpa and my paternal aunt. And my foster sister, her name was Ruby. And we seemed, there are no memories of harm or badness or evil or hurt in those fleeting memories I have as a 6-year-old. The village was close-knit. People looked after each other. They shared their wealth. They shared food and material things. There was only one language spoken in the community, The culture was really strong. We had many potlatches, many feasts. There was so much festivity about the idea of celebrating life around us. It seemed that everybody had a role, everybody had responsibilities. But there was nothing more important than this, that the child in our universe, the child in our society, was the center of our universe. We were so loved, so cared for, so nurtured. The whole community, it seems, looked out for our safety and security. It was even, the care of our children was even exercised in our legends and our songs and dances, through our Genesis stories, like I said, through rites of passage, rituals, and ceremonies. All of these things were intended to guide us through our development and growth and to protect us throughout the course of our lifetime. We have, for instance, a ceremony called Hituguila, and it was applied when a child became 10 months old. Hituguila means that someone has lived long enough that there's certainty that they're going to remain alive. So they had this ceremony to celebrate that this young child was no longer hovering between the spirit world and our families. So they painted his face with ochre, cut off some of his hair and singed it, washed his face, put anklets and wristlets around him, all intended to be symbols of protection and safety and validation that the little one had become a part of us human family. They were given a first name, and they appointed warriors, young men, who would be somewhat like godparents, in this case, for this child. And they would be asked to look after the care of this child for as long as they lived in the same place. And the whole community was invited and asked to attend and witness the ceremony, and also asked to help raise the child. So when I think about that, the safety of the child was almost guaranteed. It was wrapped in origin stories, Genesis stories, rites of passage. They were given names and dances, and they were taught the narrative of our history and our beginnings, who we were. And all of this teaching and mentoring was important because that's how you nurtured the child every day, reminded the child of their value, and of course, eventually their purpose. We, as children, little children, were taught and mentored almost every moment. We always knew who our relatives were. And when I became a teenager, it used to really bug me. I'd find a new girlfriend, and my mother would say, "Oh, no, you can't go with her, that's your relative." And that would so upset me. I think we were all related. So that was something I didn't like about our culture. But we were taught where we did come from, who our family and relatives were, and all of those things that affirmed our place in the universe. Our parents, our grandparents, our aunts played a big part in our lives. Terms of endearment were constant. My granny, Nulai, her other name was Kunkwala Sukwilak, Thunderbird Lady, had all these powerful terms of endearment for all of us. She would say, "Kioset lagin ikessa." There'd be long pause. "Kasuk yoslach." I am absolutely nothing without you. And then I'd feel so good. I'd be overflowing with a sense of being important and being loved. And then another old man who raised me was a chief. His name was Kwayemji, big whale. And he would say, "We gila zolachans sasam kasuk yostaklach." Madzono Sinadla. What would we do? What would our purpose be without you? And so all these adults in these communities were saying these wonderful, wonderful sayings to us little kids. They were constant expressions. There were other things like wadzid, monumental treasure. Little kids, wadzid, yo wadzid, hello wadzid, hello monumental child. Glugwe, supernatural gift. Wolkine, spiritual blessing. Wisabidu, special little one. Mayan, respected and treasured. And because of those words, we did grow up feeling all of those things. Kindness was, it seemed at least, everywhere. Love existed. It was in itself a science honed through millennia, this notion of a child's place and the love that they deserved. But pretty soon all things were to change. Of course, I ended up in this Indian residential school in Alert Bay. And then all hell broke loose. I just wanted to give a brief general background about those residential schools. Some of you have heard about residential schools, especially here in British Columbia. They were started in the 1870s. At the height of it, there were over 130 residential schools operating across the country. The last one closed in 1996. That's not so long ago. But get this, over 150,000 little children were snatched from our homes, and taken to these schools, and then begun that spiral of our own existence and civilization. The mortality rates were as high as 60% sometimes. In 1909, Dr. Peter Bryce of Indian Affairs reported that between 1894 and 1908, that mortality rates ranged from 30 to 60% over 5 years in Western Canada. I've had a lot of time to think about my life experience and to think about what has happened to Aboriginal people in our country. And I keep asking why. I can't imagine anybody doing that again ever, coming to take your kids or your grandkids. And so it's important for us to ask why that happened, even if we think it's historical, although it's not that historical. What on earth were they thinking? In the name of God, what on earth were they thinking? Part of the answer lies in the fact that schools were set up to eliminate parental involvement in the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual development of Aboriginal children. This was a policy of forced assimilation. And worse than that, the intent, and it's described in the archival material, the intent was to kill the Indian in the child. So that's a backdrop to those residential schools. I'm going to add a few remarks about my own personal experience in those schools. I was just turning 7. I'd never been away from family or community when I was dropped off at St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Alert Bay. Suddenly, I was in a foreign place. The people who were there were foreign to me. The food was foreign. The language was foreign. And I was dropped off there. There was absolutely no explanation. My mother was holding me by the hand. We walked up these steps. We got into the hallway, met the strange man, turned over to him. My mother turned around. She didn't say anything. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say, you know what, don't worry, I'll be back for you soon. I'll come and visit you often. She just turned and left and walked away. And then for 11 years, I spent 11 years in that school. And I always wondered, why? Why and how could this happen to me and to all of those other little children? The first thing they did was take us down into the shower room, shaved our hair off, stripped us down, prodded us in every secret place, brushed us with this white substance, put coil oil in our hair. It was right from that first day, for a little child, very demeaning and humiliating. And there were endless lineups that I remember in that school. And you couldn't speak your own language. It was a sin to speak your own language. And for every infraction, for every word that we spoke in this language, because we didn't know any English yet, there were brutal responses. There were all kinds of punishment. There were beatings, strappings, pulling of the ear, cuffing of the ear, bare naked strapping in front of the entire school, quarantined sometimes, and we even had a chicken coop in that school, 4 by 4 by 4. And if you didn't behave, you'd be thrown into that, and you'd have bread and water for the whole day as a means of punishment. In short, it was really brutish, really cruel, and I couldn't understand it. How can little children understand that? How can we understand it? How can adults understand it? And yet, that happened, and nobody said a word. Nobody lifted a hand and said, wait a minute, that's wrong to treat people like that. And so there were other kinds of abuse. There was emotional abuse, constant racist remarks, belittling, humiliation, and embarrassment. I can't remember any moments or any acts of kindness or love in all of the time that I was in that school. And all of those things I just described were personal experiences of mine. There were other things that were just as evil and cruel. A couple of years ago, I went before an independent assessment process, and it was government designed along with the churches and some of us survivors and Aboriginal organizations, and it was intended to be a response to the severe physical harm that many of us experienced and the sexual abuse that happened in our lives. So I went before this independent assessment process, and I told them about my experience as a little 6-year-old turning 7, that I was abused by a male and female supervisor all at the same time, and that I was beat up so badly so many times that I lost my hearing, that throughout the course of my development in those early years, I moved further and further and further back in the classroom seating because I couldn't hear and I didn't want to be embarrassed about not knowing what was said. Loneliness was one of the big factors in our lives. It was constant. There were so many tears. Hunger was never far. Poor health was always present. There were so many losses. The ability to feel, the ability to love, to communicate, to socialize, and to learn, to become educated. We couldn't even do that. So I stayed in that school. I'm going to leave that part of my story. I stayed in that school and I graduated. And by the time I graduated, I already was a full-blown alcoholic. I had my first drink when I was 14 years old. I envy social drinkers. I have never in my entire lifetime had a social drink. It was always to achieve some oblivion to achieve, have a void in my feelings, and not to remember those things that happened to the little kid that should have grown up normal. But anyway, when I graduated, I finally returned to the big school that we belonged to, and the principal said, "I want to talk to you." And I didn't like him. We didn't get along. He was the guy that strapped me in front of all of the students, buck naked. He was the guy that quarantined me 2 or 3 times in a room where nobody could speak to me for 2 days all weekend. But I knew I'd never see him again, so I said, "Of course, I'll come and talk to you." It's funny. The guy said, "I know that we have had a lot of differences, but for what it's worth, I think you're going to make it." That's so funny, so strange. I don't know whether to laugh or cry or to get angry. I didn't do any of those. I turned around, went out the front door, and I stood at the top steps of that big school. There were 15 steps down to the ground. But before I could take the first step, I realized as I was standing there, I had nowhere to go. I had absolutely no sense of purpose or value in my life. In fact, I was hopeless. I couldn't see any future. I didn't know what I would want to do with my life. I was ill-equipped to dream. Remember when you graduated and you all had your dreams and life was exciting? The future was waiting for you. For too many of us, we didn't have that experience. And so we entered the real world, broken, in despair, not knowing what would happen to us. I eventually got married, though, when I got out of that school. I had 5 kids. I have 6 grandkids. But I remember thinking before I got married that I would never be lonely, ever, ever again. I would marry, my wife would be my wife, she's my possession. I would have kids, and these kids would be my kids forever. You see, I didn't learn in that school that you need to nurture relationships with your spouse, that you need to nurture it with your children, that it's a privilege to be married and to have family, not a right. I didn't know that. And nobody taught me one social skill. So because of that, though, I had so many ghosts that haunted me all my life. Even when I had good jobs, even when I had a big home in Kamloops River, 2 or 3 cars in a garage, I just kept sinking deeper into my alcoholism. Pretty soon I lost everything, my home, my family, my job, my dignity. I found myself in the deepest, darkest abyss I have ever been in. And I eventually lost my family. I had this great big house. A hydro came to cut the power off. I was unemployed. And I began to sink deeper and deeper. I couldn't understand, couldn't face the music. So one day, in a drunken stupor in Campbell River, that's where I lived for a long time, I ran into a friend and he said, "You know what, Bobby? I don't like what you're doing to yourself. You should get out of town. Come fish with me." Well, I knew I was in deep trouble. I didn't argue. I said, "I'll come and fish with you." So he said, "You know where the boat is? Go down there now, and we'll pull out early in the morning." So I barely remember getting on the boat, and I must have got to the bunks, where the bunks are, and passed out. But early the next morning, I woke up, and I thought, where am I? But pretty soon it all flooded back. I'm still an alcoholic. The booze smell oozes out of your pores. The despair floods over you again. And I looked around and everybody was sleeping. I was so ashamed of myself. I got out of that bunk and I walked through the engine room up to the galley, and I went to the back of the boat where there's a huge big drum, and there was absolutely nobody around for miles except my friends who were still sleeping. And I got to the back of the boat and I dropped and I just wept. I couldn't control my tears. I couldn't take it anymore. And I said, God, help me. It wasn't really a prayer because I'd been angry at God for some time now. But as I said, God, help me, I began to open my eyes and I saw the ocean in front of me. I've never seen ocean like it before. The colors, the lightning, that ocean was so special and beautiful and powerful and living. And I kept elevating my gaze, and I saw Vancouver Island on the other side, and I saw the forests. And they too had lightning bolts in it, green as green can be, lush. And soon I gazed at the heavens, and I saw the entire universe. We all have our ideas about what the universe looks like. I can never again give full description to this universe that I gazed upon. And as I gazed upon the universe, I heard this voice say to me, in spite of what you've done to yourself, I love you, and you're a part of all of this. And so in that millisecond, hearing that word, I understand how powerful love is. That it can transform our lives, our families, our communities, our countries. That's how powerful love is. And then soon after that, I began on this road of healing. And soon it turned to reconciliation. Suddenly, I had hope that things could be different for me. Things could be different from others who despair and are lonely and broken. And so I came to Vancouver and I worked for the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. And during that work, I conducted and facilitated dozens and dozens of dialogue, talking circles with survivors. I began to hear their stories. I began to hear their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations. And then something else happened. The federal government initiated a national set of dialogues, 7 of them. And there were church people, survivor people, Indian politicians, white politicians. They were all there. We were trying to wrestle with this demon that was getting out of hand. We were discovering that our history was a much uglier thing than we had known. That abuse and genocide and harm and loss were much more prevalent than anything we'd ever seen. And the court cases began to mount, coming from survivors. And the church and we, government, realized that it would take over 50 years to respond to all of those survivors who claimed abuse. And so we started talking about alternate dispute resolution processes, and we started talking about a truth commission for Canada, and we started lobbying for the Prime Minister to make an apology, and we negotiated for a settlement agreement that paid out reparation, and all of that came to be. Here's what I've learned, that while we can respond in ways that people think are inadequate, every tool that we have must be brought to bear and used as building blocks for the things we desire and want to achieve. There is nothing hopeless. I know in the Indian community across this country, there is more hope right now, this moment, more healing than any time in all of our history together with you. And that's a great promise for Aboriginal people. And now We're in this new era, this era of reconciliation. I'm an ambassador for reconciliation. I get all these fancy titles, ambassador, special advisor. I think it's when they find less and less for you to do, they'll give you this title and just honor you, right? So what we've been doing in Reconciliation Canada is bring people together so that we can have a dialogue that we've never had before. And we don't focus just on Aboriginals. We focus on us, you and me. Every color, every race, every creed, every ethnicity, we got to have this discussion. Canada is too important, too sacred to allow it simply to just move along on its own energy. We have to recognize, embrace, and celebrate our diversity. With this deeper dialogue and understanding, we're going to create new relationships in this country. So, in the course of that time that I've just described, the journey of healing and reconciliation has been paved with many, many kind acts of kindness. It's always been underlaid by love, hitherto unknown or demonstrated. And it always has been sprinkled with hope, grounded in the resilience of the human mind and good people like yourselves. It has always been there as expressed by the elders in that video. It is present now as demonstrated by the 70,000 people who walked together in September in the name of reconciliation, in the name of our oneness, in the name of our relationships, in the hope that we can empower all of us to create a vision together about our future that is different than the one we've had. So I think one of the things that we need to do, and this will be my final comments, I think that as in ancient times, we must reinstate a sense of reverence and sanctity for everything and everybody. How do you do that? By ritual, by ceremony, by prayer, by self-talk, by holding each other up. There's lots of ways to do it. You can do it. All of us can do it. And we must acknowledge the divinity of this place. Especially here in Canada, we are so blessed to be here. All of us. You have a right, all of you, to be here, as I have. And we should begin to share the responsibility of caring for this place. That would be the greatest act of kindness that we can do. That would be the greatest kind of love that we could gift to our country, to our fellow human beings, and to the world. Just remember again that kindness and love begins with you, with me. We can leave it here when you go today, or we carry it with us and make it a pursuit, make it a passion to foster and nourish and encourage kindness and love every day. On my way here this afternoon, I stopped by at the little library just down the corner. And I remember in that residential school, we were taught much religion, way too much religion. And I hated religion. It confused me so much so that one time when I was traveling with fellow peacemakers along the Jordan River, we got to this place where John the Baptist was said to have baptized Jesus. And I thought, oh my God, I'm here. What if it's real? What if that's the only way? I better get baptized. So off I went and got some cloak to be able to jump in the river. We had a priest traveling with us. So I got baptized on the Jordan River. But I wanted to read this because it's important, whether it comes from the Bible or any other source. I want you to go home this evening and think about love. And I'll read what this small bit of scripture says. It could be said by anybody, actually. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others, and it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. I thought that was a wonderful way to end that. Thank you.